I'd love to introduce you now to those of you who don't know. Most people at Hofstra will, of course, know, and beyond, will know Robbie Guttmann, who is a professor of economics and is also the chair of the Department of Economics here at Hofstra. He is an absolutely invaluable resource here in our community because he speaks to and speaks so eloquently to the issues of the times. There's no one who's better able to talk to us about the economic crisis we find ourselves in. He teaches international economics as well as monetary economics and economic integration in the European Union and public finance. He is, for those of you who don't know about his most recent book, Cyber Cash. It's a wonderful book, The Coming Era of Electronic Money, which is a Palgrave book, 2003. And he's also currently working on a new book, so watch for that, which will focus on many of the issues he raises here today. So we are delighted and honored, as always, and so grateful he is among us. I'd like to introduce you to, if you don't know him already, Professor Robert Guttmann.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Good. Thanks for coming so numerously. I'll try my best to not disappoint. It's not easy for me to talk about the ongoing situation because it's very complicated, and I'm of divided mind. I find that usually very productive inside of my head, but when I have to voice it towards the external world, I'm not sure how it comes out. It's a really pretty unprecedented situation. But I will do my best to sort of frame it for you. First of all, I will basically try to make 4 or 5 points. One about the nature of this crisis, how we try to deal with it. That's the second point. The third point, the effects of how we try to deal with this. Fourthly, where we're going from now. And fifthly, what we have to do to kind of settle down into a better growth picture in the near future. So there's a certain segment of what I'm thinking about that I try to convey to you in a sort of meaningfully sequential fashion. First of all, my first point is that this is not your normal recession. We do have a growth pattern in capitalism that is cyclical. You have business cycles. They are recurrent. They are 4 to 7 years. You have downturns. We had the last downturn. We had 2 downturns, one in 1990-91, then in 2000, 2001. This is quite different, okay? This is not your normal downturn. So it's really, you can look at those downturns a bit like having a cold. They go away. They come and they go away. What we do have here is something more serious, more in the area of pneumonia. I would think of this as a structural crisis. So my first theme here is that this particular situation that we faced since August 2007 is a structural crisis. And they're much rarer, they're much more serious. Economists do not know much about structural crisis. This is not a phenomenon that they study very much. There are some economists that have tried to do so, but structural crisis, for those few of us that do work on this, it's part of a longer wave pattern in the capitalism. You can take a very long view of capitalism, and then you realize that beyond the business cycles, there's also long waves. 40, 50-year cycles. And these long waves, when they turn from a long upward phase to a long downward phase, do have more serious crises as their turning points. Right? There's a lot of, what I'm trying to do precisely is to get a modern version out of this long wave dynamic. Right? That's part of what I hope to achieve before I die as my contribution to economics. And it's a fascinating topic because you can only understand long waves when you have a historic view, an institutional view, a political view, and it kind of accommodates my interest in sociology and social psychology, etc., as well as history. But one way to look at the long waves is to look at an evolutionary set of phases of capitalism and to see how it organizes itself over generational spans, right? And so my current work, which is what my book is about, my next book is about, is to look at a phase in capitalism that I call finance-led capitalism. So if you Google Robert Guttmann with 2 T's and 2 N's and then add finance-led capitalism, you see where I'm standing, because there's going to be a series of articles that I have already published that out of which I try to distill this book. That's enough. Not more than that, because otherwise I will lose you. I want to talk about more current things, but part of what I'm thinking is precisely this special nature of finance that drove us into a structural crisis. So now about structural crisis. As I said, we don't know much about them. Right? And the best we can do is to go back to previous structural crises and see what happened there. This is the fourth one that we've had that we know a lot about. The first one was in 1873 to 1879. We had one in 1929 to 1939. We had then another one in 1979 to 1982. And we now have the fourth one in the last 150 years, 2007 to question mark. And when you look at structural crisis, these four events, you see certain patterns that happen. They're important to understand because they will give us a better sense of what we're facing here. First of all, a structural crisis is a crisis that is global in nature. All the structural crises happen on a global scale. And it's global in nature because it is a build-up over several decades of international imbalances that explodes and that causes this very serious crisis, right? So later on, if you're interested in, I can kind of give you a better sense of the particular types of constellations of global imbalances that led to each one of those 3 or 4 crises, right, including this one. But you get a global crisis, and it's a global crisis because a particular growth pattern has become unsustainable thanks to underlying imbalances, the seriousness of which we don't see until it explodes. That's the first thing. The second thing about structural crisis is that when it explodes as a major financial crisis, as a systemic crisis. You have a financial crisis that basically is systemic in the sense that it endangers the normal functioning of banks. And with the normal functioning of banks being impeded, everything else gets hampered or pushed down. Or disrupted, because we all depend on banks. Banks are like the heart of the system. If you think of the economy as a body, the banks are the heart of that body. And so you have a heart attack, basically. And heart attacks are serious. Now, when you have the heart attack, you then get a process called a debt deflation spiral. That's what makes to everybody around us a structural crisis that much more serious than a recession, because in a recession you have like a cold, but here you have a pneumonia, and you know it because you have this very serious process where everybody's trying to generate cash to survive as fast as possible in a depressed market. So you have to sell output at lower prices, you have to sell assets off to generate cash. You have the problem with the financial crisis is that you're left with very high debt levels that you've accumulated and debt servicing charges, and suddenly your income generating capacity to meet those debt servicing charges has sharply declined, and so now you have a squeeze, and you're trying to survive this squeeze by basically selling yourself, okay? And so you have a spiral because it gets worse. The more everybody's trying to sell, the more prices get depressed, the more you have to sell even more to generate a certain minimum amount of cash to survive, not to go bankrupt. What you then have to do, and this is crucial, you have to stop the spiral, because if you don't stop the spiral, you get a depression. That's when you get an economic depression. Right? And a depression is a period of, it's a long period of very subdued economic activity. You're operating at maybe 20% less than before. You have double-digit unemployment for years, and it's utter misery. And you want to stop that, right? So the key is to have massive intervention, as you will have to have in a heart attack, to not die, to not have this debt deflation spiral get out of hand and become a depression. So that's the challenge of a structural crisis that we've just gone through. Now, an extraordinary crisis like this requires extraordinary intervention. You have to stop the debt deflation spiral before it's too late. You have a certain window of opportunity before it's too late. And the good news is that our policymakers did react rapidly, massively, and relatively well. Relatively well. Well enough to stop the debt deflation spiral from driving us down into a depression. So the good news is that in all likelihood we will not have a depression. And that, I think, is very good news, because depressions, I don't know whether some of you are here that remember that, or certainly your parents have talked to you about this. I certainly am old enough to have my parents talk about it. It's hell. And we're not going to go through that. We intervened enough. And where we intervened is, I mean, of course, in the phase of when the debt deflation spiral exploded, which was the September 15th, 2008, we immediately reacted, right? Within 3 weeks, we had a $700 billion TARP fund to basically backstop the banking system. We had the Fed triple its size in 2 months, setting up 20 or 23 liquidity injection channels and asset purchase channels, basically to stop the heart attack. We then had a large enough, not large in my opinion enough, but a significant stimulus package, which could have been distributed a bit better, but it was still good enough to stop the free fall that we went through. And we, most importantly, we also set up a global coordination mechanism called G20, which is the group of 20. Usually it's actually like 30, 35, because everybody wants to be part of it, and we all say, oh, yeah, you can come in, you can come. But as a core group, we have the 20 largest economies of the world that are 85% of total global GDP. And they're meeting every 6 months. They're meeting tomorrow in Pittsburgh, and they sort of coordinate. And the first coordination was that everybody's doing the same thing. Everybody's backstopping their banking system. Everybody is recapitalizing the banks. Everybody's pumping money into the economy through fiscal stimulation, through budgetary stimulation. And everybody's trying to figure out then how to start a set of reforms. Okay, but now in the phase where we're trying to negotiate longer-term reforms, which makes it a harder part of the process. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But so we had a pretty intense response and a fairly good response, and that we learned some historic lessons. Okay, I mean, it's not a coincidence that Bernanke, the current chair of the Fed, is one of the great economists having studied the Great Depression. Right? He's the specialist on deflation in America. And he was a famous economist before he became the Federal Reserve chair. Famous precisely because of his historic studies on the Great Depression and on the deflation spiral. So that's a nice little coincidence, right? It's not quite a coincidence that the man is right there at the right time. But it helps, whatever. So we now have a stabilization process underway, right? And the economy is sort of settling down. It's probably settled enough to say that it may. I mean, Bernanke said last week that the recession is probably over. It's too early to tell, but you have enough science. You have enough science to say that. So it's not a crazy thing to say, right? We will only find out later when exactly the recession ended, right? Of course, it doesn't feel like that. It's like you're still weak, and you still have rising unemployment as a lagging variable, and all kinds of things. But technically speaking, in terms of the relationship between different variables that make up the economy, you can say that we sort of hit bottom. That's probably the best thing the best way to frame it. We've hit bottom. And we have what we call an inventory cycle. I mean, that's a pretty strong stimulus right now. I mean, what happened is that businesses reacted so incredibly fast, reducing output and reducing employment, that they actually overshot. And now they're stocking up. And so you have an inventory cycle. Whether that's going to be enough to keep the economy going forward is a different question. But you have a fairly strong inventory cycle. And you also have, what's important, you have a reversal of the disintegration of the globalization channels. When the economy went into free fall during the heart attack, what was really stunning was how much the global economy shrank. You realize then in ex post factum, after the fact, that the global aspects of our economy have very strong positive multiplier effects during normal periods. They carry our economy, our domestic economy forward. But they're quite fragile, and they can go sharply in reverse. So our economy shrank 6-7%, but trade shrank 15 to 20%. Capital flows across borders shrank 30 to 40%. Remittances and income flows between countries shrank 40 to 50%. That's like a sharper reversal of international economic ties than happened during the Great Depression. I mean, it only lasted for 6 months, luckily, but stopping that already stabilizes the economy. Okay, so we're now beginning to see a resumption of growth, a resumption of capital flows, a resumption of income being transferred gradually, and that shows up statistically as a significant stabilization and resumption of growth for domestic economies. But the point is that we're totally embedded in the global economy, and we're very vulnerable to its fluctuations that are quite amplified and amplify our economic cycles. And that's something that we need to keep in mind, and that's something that the degree of which only we became aware of in a crisis. A crisis is healthy in the sense that you see things that you never see otherwise, and you think about things that you never dare to think otherwise. Okay, so the crisis has a very salient feature of like reminding you and also amplifying things that you've tried to ignore or tried to downplay. Okay, so it's also a window for massive increases in our knowledge. And so that's what we see. So you have several features in place that kind of have stabilized the economy and actually may move it forward to a slow growth pattern. Including the stabilization of the financial system, okay, thanks to massive intervention by the Fed and other central banks. So with that in place, the next question, my third point, is like, where are we now? How do we go forward? What's going to happen in the next few years, right? And that, honestly, we don't know, okay? We don't know the shape of the recovery. We have 4 scenarios, and they all can be best sort of crystallized as letters. We have a V-shaped recovery, a U-shaped recovery, and reverse L-shaped recovery, or a W-shaped recovery. And we're scratching our heads to figure out which is which and what's what and which is the most likely, okay? A V-shaped recovery, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but the V-shaped recovery from our point of view would be the best, but it's the least likely. That's a recovery that's as strong up as it went down in a short period of time, so that by 2011 we're back to where we were in 2007, okay? Now, there's some signs that this is possible, especially what's going on in China, even though I don't think what's going on in China is sustainable, but China has resumed very rapid growth very rapidly, okay? So some countries have been able to get into a mode of a potential V shape, and they're large economies. China is the 2nd largest economy in the world right now. So also you have a pattern from recessions where you have a sharp recession, you also have a sharp recovery. But I would argue that this is not your normal recession. And so it's not so sure that you can kind of rely on the previous patterns of what are not the same type of crisis. That's my argument. But V-shape is possible, and V-shape would be good for us, because then by 2011 you have actually a resumption. I mean, unemployment rates come down, you have a resumption of growth, et cetera, that is sustainable. U-shaped is a much slower recovery, okay? You hang around the bottom for a while, and then you gradually come up, okay? Given the amount of damage done to our banking system, and given the amount of damage done to the consumer's psyche, the American consumer's psyche, and given the amount of damage done to certain industries in this crisis, it's possible that you're not going to be able to have a rapid recovery, okay? It's not like you're going to be running fast after a heart attack. And so U-shaped is possible. U-shaped is possible. Now, then you get the other 2 scenarios, the L-shaped and the W-shaped, and they're out of the ordinary. Neither of these 2 are normal, okay? In normal times, with normal business cycles, you have either V-shaped or U-shaped. You do not have L-shaped, and you do not have a W-shaped. But we do recognize somehow, I certainly do, other economists more or less too, that we are not living through a normal cycle, that this is different. And the difference could be an L-shaped, it's not like L like this, but L like this. You go down and then you stay down on a depressed level for quite some time. If we look back to an example that we've had before, which would be Japan. Japan went through a similar asset bubble that we had, a similar destruction of the asset bubble in a very, very spectacular crisis. This was in 1989, 1990, and then stayed for 12 years down. Flat in the water, down maybe 10, 15% below its previous peak, okay? That's entirely possible for us as well. That has to do, and here you have certain indicators that tell you whether it's going to be possible or not, but you have a deflationary dynamic in the world economy that while you have stopped the debt deflation spiral, you have contained the worst outbreaks of the deflationary dynamic, you have not overcome the deflationary dynamic. It's still too strong and it still depresses us, okay? And so we have to be prepared for a very long period of basic stagnation at below full capacity. Then you have the fourth scenario where you're getting all giddied up about the resumption of growth. You return to old habits. You have not put into place stabilizing structural reforms. And then you have another crisis in the next year or two, and then you have another recession. You have a W. A W is not W in the sense that it goes like this, but a W goes like this, and then you go down even further because you have a recession here. So you have a double dip crisis, I mean, the 79-82 crisis was a double dip crisis. So that's a very interesting historic precedent for us. That's also entirely possible, and what we cannot know about this are two things. One is that we don't know how sick our financial system still is. It's very sick, we know that, but we don't know how sick it is and how easily we can fix it. We cannot have a sustainable recovery without a financial system returning to health. That's the issue. I mean, this is, as I said, the heart. You can't really walk around if your heart is still palpating and not distributing well and whatever. So the other issue that is decisive here is that I haven't even been talking about too much, is the set of global imbalances that got us to where we are, that got us to this crisis, okay? That set of global imbalances could return, but it's not a sustainable set. We could go back to an old growth pattern and we would have the recession again. And we would have it much faster than the last time because financial investors know that it broke for that reason, and when we get back to it, they won't wait around to just patiently let it break by itself. They'll panic. So we have a couple of issues out there that are very, very nerve-wracking and that may cause us more pain to come if we're not careful. They're avoidable. They're avoidable, but they're there. They have to be addressed. They have to be faced. And the key global imbalance is the global imbalance centered around the United States. Because the United States was the locomotive of the global economy in the previous long wave, and it was based on socially organized excess spending, okay, by Americans financed by the rest of the world. And the rest of the world was financing this because the rest of the world earned dollars from its exports, because we have a dollar-based world economy. Okay, so this is part of an institutional arrangement that started in 1945, with the dollar as having this dual role as our currency, but also the international currency, so that other countries dealing with each other have dollars. So there's 2 times as many dollars outside than here. And basically, the rest of the world earning surpluses then at some point, starting in 1985, decided to just recycle it into the US and have the US overspend, thereby sustaining their export-led growth strategies. It's like a deal between a drug addict and a set of drug dealers, okay? And in a way, the drug addict overdosed. And that's us, and that's a troubling constellation for growth, right? You can't dope the economy that much more. Okay, so you got to figure out a new global growth pattern. That's the real challenge. Okay, and that's dawning on the policymakers, and they're trying to negotiate that, right? So you're going to have a fascinating, I would almost say, historic discussion tomorrow and Friday in Pittsburgh, in the context of the G20 meetings, as to what's the new growth dynamic of the next 20, 25 years. and globally coordinated growth dynamic, because it's not going to magically emerge, right? Nobody can take the place of this drug addict. So it's got to be probably also with different types of drugs. And the key drug here, of course, is also the challenge that we have with climate change, which is like redoing our economy, retrofitting our economy in terms of energy, and also in terms of carbon emissions and so forth, right? So we could go from a finance-led capitalism to an energy-led capitalism. And I think that's what's going to happen, and that's what's going to save us. But we need to organize this. We need to organize this. And we have to organize this in a very, very short span of time. So there's a lot of pressure to make reforms. And I don't think that the American public in particular is ready for it, certainly not the political constellation of Congress, okay? So Obama, I think, has a very good sense of this. And I've been just listening to his speech in the United Nations, and I thought that he really has a sense of this. But I don't think he has the public with him or Congress with him to make the necessary reforms that will assure us a relatively propitious ending of this crisis with a new type of growth dynamic that gets sustainable. So that's basically what I'm trying to say. If there's questions, I would, otherwise I'll just pick up where I left off. Yes? There's a microphone right next to you.
They imposed a tariff on Chinese tires. I'm not quite sure whether that was a good idea, and I'm wondering if that could possibly lead to a trade war with China, who has threatened to retaliate for those tariffs.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very important question, right? Because one of the things that gets us into like L-shaped or W-shaped recessions, and that means a much longer crisis, is protectionism, right? It's where everybody's cutting everybody else's markets. And it doesn't even have to be retaliation. I mean, if we deprive other countries from selling here, then we deprive them from earning dollars, and if we deprive them from earning dollars, they don't buy as much from us, and B, they don't lend us as much. So cutting them means cutting us, and so that has to be very, very clear. We can't go down that temptation. And one of the great reasons why the Great Depression happened as the Great Depression was one of the three policy mistakes that we did was to basically try to get rid of imports by having a 40% across the board tariff in the United States. That was in 1930. And that killed the world economy and assured us a Great Depression. We do know from history not to do this again. Now, that's one thing. The other thing is that this tire thing has enough special features not to bother me as much as other measures would have bothered me, right? Because it is within the guidelines of the WTO rules, the World Trade Organization rules. So we're not violating rules here. We have the authority to do that because there's a regime called safeguard regimes. When you have a sudden surge of imports, you can respond to that. And we've had a sudden surge of imports of tires. The Chinese tires are just a minor part. Much more important is Dunlop, Michelin, Pirelli, and so forth, tires made elsewhere. But when you think of the growth of Chinese tires, they were disproportionately higher than the rest. It just went from 2% market share to 7% market share. But there's a surge, and you can respond. And so we use the safeguard clause that we're entitled to, and this is the first time that it gets used. So this is also an interesting test case of WTO rules. And if the WTO rules actually, ironically, if China keeps its retaliation also within the set of rules, which actually, while it's talking big, its actual plans of measures is pretty modest, then you have tested a very important part of the WTO that is currently being in super contention for the conclusion of the Doha round, and it may, in a very, very, very funny way, actually make the conclusion of this current global trade negotiation round easier. So I don't know whether this seems like a perverse answer, because on the surface of it, it's a very protectionist step to take. But it's not. It has a very, very specific context, and it tests something that we need to have tested before we can sit down and say, okay, let's make a deal. And that may happen. We do need to conclude the Doha round, that I have to say. Otherwise, we do have a lot of pressures of protectionism, and we go down a dangerous route. With the Doha round concluded, we probably won't be able to go down that route.
Hi, Professor.
Yes, hi, Emil.
How does inflation fix the structural and international imbalances?
Well, inflation, I think our bigger problem is deflation, which is the opposite of inflation. It's a more serious problem than inflation. But we will be tempted by inflation, and we could have an inflationary type of recovery 4, 5, 6 years from now. Not until then, right? We're far away from any inflationary uptick. You may have certain types of key strategic products exploding prices, certainly raw materials, foodstuff, gold, energy, but that's because we have troubles with those sectors. That's not a generalized inflation. The temptation of generalized inflation comes from governments wanting to reduce their debt burden. Inflation reduces debt burdens. Inflation is tempting for debtors, and we are a key debtor. We are a big debtor, and it may in that sense palliate the pain of our global debt burden. That's one issue. But it's also very clear that the foreign holders of our debt, the creditors to the U.S., are not at all willing to accept that, and they would cause a dollar crisis before they would see us go down the inflation route, right? So you would have another recession, you would have a double-dip recession to prevent that outcome, right? So I'm not worried about inflation. I am not worried about inflation.
It's not really inflation, but I'm just wondering how printing money fixes structural imbalances and international imbalances.
That's different. The Fed went from $834 billion size to $2.34 trillion. It tripled, right? But printing money is a bit like pumping blood into your system when your system is losing a lot of blood, okay? And so you have to do that, right? If you don't have that mechanism, then your body loses. You have a massive destruction in a crisis like a heart attack that I was talking about. You have massive destruction of income and wealth, and the pumping of money is basically a way of slowing that process down, right? And it worked. It worked. We would be in a depression without that.
Before we get some of the other folks to ask questions, are there any students who would like to ask questions and maybe feel intimidated? Why don't you come up to the microphone?
Hi. It seems like you advocate Keynesian economic policies and like the Green Revolution that Thomas L. Friedman also advocates. And you just said that you're not necessarily in fear of inflation, but what can the government do, given that we just had a massive economic stimulus, which wasn't executed properly, which you previously mentioned, and how do we avoid, maybe not hyperinflation, but inflation to a point where it's counterproductive to our economic recovery?
Well, at the risk of repeating myself, right? Inflation, it's like sweat. You don't sweat normally, okay, unless you have hyperactive glands. But you sweat because you run too fast, and that's one type of inflation. That's an overheating. We call this demand pull inflation. Or you sweat because you're sick, and that's cost push inflation. But we don't have those conditions. We have another sickness, okay? We have like a sickness where we're like really, really cold, okay? People have this idea that just if you print a lot of money, that's automatically inflationary. It's the relationship between money and output, and the circuits, that the money that you pump in, how it goes through and becomes output, that may or may not cause inflation, right? There's a balancing act going on that if it goes like that, you get inflation, right? And so as I insist, we are nowhere near that. This is like the wrong illness. This is like a malpracticing doctor, okay? And it may happen several years from now, but certain things will have to happen to get there, that we will have that problem, right? But right now we have a different illness. We are still under a debt deflation threat. Okay?
Thank you.
You've been talking in academic terms, but I'd like you to talk in human terms. You're talking about the recession being almost over. People are losing their jobs, and the unemployment is going higher and higher. People are losing their homes. The banks are recovering, but what about the poor and the middle class people?
Yes, I mean, look, I live in New York City, and I can see it very, very clearly. There's a human tragedy out there that is, I mean, a 1% decline in GDP kills 30,000 people. That's an incredibly enormous burden. And what we do have here is particularly more than painful, almost collectively depressing. The problem is that the Americans have very little safety net. Okay, that's so they are like a society that has to constantly run to sort of hold yourself above. Right? I mean, I'm European, so I'm used to seeing economies with much larger social safety nets. And I go to Paris every month and work there, and I see how the social safety net there, even when I mean, it's not fun to be unemployed. I've been unemployed a couple of times. It's a long time back, and now I'm a tenured professor. And one of the reasons why I became a college professor was precisely to have job security. But Americans don't have job security to the degree that others. They don't have savings to the degree that others, and they don't have the social safety net to the degree of others. And they don't necessarily have very good mortgages to the degree of others. So we are extremely vulnerable as a society. We may be the richest country in the world, even though I don't think we are anymore. But we have huge vulnerabilities as the price to pay for it. And so it's a human tragedy, and it's a very complicated tragedy also to the degree that you have the crisis was a crisis of a housing bubble. Okay, so we were floating on a bubble and had a wealth effect, thinking of ourselves as richer than we are, and that sector went into a depression when the bubble burst. So you have the biggest assets of most Americans in free fall. And we know now from looking at different cities that it only stabilizes after having fallen 40, 50%. Yes. We have now 8 cities out of the 25 greater metropolitan areas where you have stabilization of that housing decline, but it's after like a 40% decline. And you're also tied to that part of the banking system that provides for mortgages. Now, luckily, the government nationalized Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and that they buy 80% of the mortgages right now, so we have some housing market at least, right? But that's entirely government-run, which also makes you wonder what's the role of government in all this, right? And it plays a very important role at this point in stabilizing things. The ultimate problem that we have is, of course, twofold. One is that unemployment is a lagging variable. It goes up way into recovery. It doesn't. Businesses have not only like laid off people, but they also have cut hours of the existing workforce a lot. We went from 44 to 36 hours average work week, and so there's a lot of slack left before you start hiring. And businesses have been hit hard. Most businesses have been hit hard not to want to hire for a while, and so unemployment is going to be with us, and also underemployment. It's not just unemployment. When you think of unemployment and underemployment together, you have a de facto, and discouraged workers together, you have a de facto unemployment rate of 21% right now. So it's incredible. It's like on a depression level. And as I said, we don't have a very good social safety net. We have 1/4 of the unemployment benefits of a German worker. And that's really, really, when you have long-term unemployment like you have now. Previously, you had in a recession, you have short-term unemployment. This is long-term unemployment, right? So workers do run out of unemployment benefits, and then there's we have no welfare system. We have nothing left, right? And so the absence of the social safety net is a tremendous problem in years to come.
Excuse me. A question regarding securitization markets, which you
Yes.
haven't had a chance to mention. I'm sure you would if you had more time.
Exactly right.
one of the fixes to the recession is the reestablishment of the global securitization markets.
Yes.
I was wondering if private label, not Fannie or Freddie, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how this could be done.
Well, I have mixed feelings about it, right? It depends how it's done. I think securitization is a good idea because it does two things. I mean, if it's properly done, it does spread risks. And it allows a large amount of capital be mobilized for the funding of directly productive activities, if it's properly done, right? So stopping securitization or making it so onerous with new regulations, like requiring banks to put a large amount of equity into it, would probably be harmful. You would throw out the baby with the bathwater. Okay, I think this can be done properly, and it has to do with underwriting standards. It has to do with sharing of gains and sharing of risks. It has to do with transparency. It has to do, above all, with the kinds of financial markets. It cannot be done over the counter. It has to be a public exchange, right? You have to have a price recovery mechanism. This was, if you think about the sudden collapse of the securitization layers, which was a $2 trillion system that suddenly within 2 weeks collapsed. That was the beginning of the crisis. That was in August 2007. Yeah. That was because it was completely, it was criminally organized. It was really a large crime machine. And so you can't go back to that. But you can have a different system of securitization and then provide a continuous flow of credit where credit is due. And so I would do that. Now, the question that you have about that then is who regulates and how do you regulate this, right? You have to have a much better cadre of regulators. You can't have top regulators that are just waiting to make millions, who are regulators to be hired later by the banks that they're regulating to become rich, like Robert Rubin. You cannot have that, right? You have to have a morally and ethically different set of standards for regulators, and you have to train them well enough and then pay them well enough not to be tempted. And that gets us to a more important point, which is the incentive structures that guide human behavior, okay? And so there's a lot of education to be done in terms of having regulators that are effective, that are moral and ethically sound, and you have to also change the incentive structures within the financial institutions to make the best of their innovations, right? And then I would also say that you have to have the innovations overseen like the FDA. You have to have I mean, the consumer, one of the proposed reforms by Obama is to have a consumer protection agency for finance. I think you have to have a protection agency also for investors in finance. You have to have some agency that can go in there and look at the structures and organizations and conventions and norms tied to those innovations and say, you're not going to do it like that. You're not going to do it like that. This is bad for our health. And you need to have people capable of doing that. And what you have here is you have to destroy a power structure in America, right? And that's the issue. The power structure is one where finance can blackmail everybody. And finance has the power to pay itself enormous amount of money irrespective of performance. We all depend on finance because we all depend on that. Collectively as a country, before the crisis, we got up every day and borrowed collectively $3 billion from the rest of the world. And that means that finance is in power. And when finance is in power, it can do what it wants and sink us. And so your question about securitization has to do with the placing, the embedding, a different embedding of finance in the economy. But that also requires us to get away from the dollar standard, to have a new type of international money, and to reorganize the global economy in a more sound way. And those are big reforms to do. And they will probably not get done until you have the other crisis that is yet to happen.
At this point in time, do you favor a weaker or stronger dollar? And could you address it from the point of view of the domestic economy as well as the global economy?
Well, yeah, that's like that's a classic question pointing to a contradiction, okay? On the one hand, you want to have a weaker dollar because a weaker dollar stimulates our exports and it will give a kick to our growth Okay, a weaker dollar functions like a tariff for imports and subsidies for exports, right? So it stimulates our economy when stimulus is needed. But a weaker dollar also means stronger currencies in Europe and Japan, and that will strangulate them, and they will then have less to lend us. So we're like, on the one hand, we want to like move forward economically by the weaker dollar. At the same time, we're still depending. I mean, we're not borrowing right now $3 billion a day, but just $1 billion a day. But we're still borrowing that $1 billion a day that needs to be generated. So we're kind of torn between the two things. Now, in the longer run, the next great crisis, which is is a dollar crisis. Okay, and so if you have a weaker dollar, you're making it more likely to get a dollar crisis. And the dollar crisis would be serious. It would be more serious than this crisis. We would have to like act in a much more fundamental way, reforming our economy. Maybe that's what's necessary to get a consensus in this country. Maybe that's what's necessary to sort of pinpoint the attention level of the political scene. I never would want to hope for that, but I also look at the political scene. I watch C-SPAN, etc., and I'm saying to myself, most of the politicians are not where it's at. They're clueless. They have no context. They have absolutely no context of what they're living through and what they're responsible to guide to, what they were elected for.
Okay, I appreciate the answers you've been giving. Touched on some things that the reason I'm standing here is because they weren't in your talk, and so I very much thank you for those answers. You talked about restoration and recovery, and you gave the different curves that they might follow and what the characteristics and what would be happening in the world. I have one question which is rhetorical. I mean, why would we want to restore what we had before 2007? You know, fighting wars with no reason, not worrying about global warming, neglecting the lives of thousands of our citizens who were made homeless by storm conditions on the Gulf Coast, and on and on. No health care and a health care system. You talked about the FDA being a model of regulation.
Well, no,
well, okay,
the FDA itself is not, but something like the FDA.
Right, like the
yes,
FDA should
the FDA
be.
itself, yes. No, I mean,
Right.
look, I don't want to disrupt you, but Bush decimated all the government agencies that were strategically important for industries. He decimated them. FEMA
Right.
used to be good. FDA used to be good. SEC used to be good. Go back to the 70s and 80s. They were good organizations and agencies where one could be proud. They're not that anymore. So I'm sorry. Yes, I should say FDA parenthesis.
But why would we want to restore a system which, since at least Ronald Reagan's presidency, has been telling us the answer to everything is privatization, and that's what he meant by privatization, was taking government money and giving nothing back to the people in the form of regulations and other things. I do have a question on, you mentioned about regulation. How can there be a regulation when there's a major business in America is the buying and selling of government?
Yes.
And you know, it just I don't think there's an answer to that question. So I give it to you to grapple with. Thank you.
Yeah, yes. Those are good questions. They're rhetorical, but they're good. One of my answers is that I don't think we're returning to the status quo ante. I think that we are making an effort to move away from it. And I think that in that sense, the Obama presidency is an important presidency historically. And I think that he has his reform agenda, for better or worse. There will be some kind of healthcare reform, and it will be just the beginning of a longer process of healthcare reform. Just as we couldn't deal with it between Truman and Obama, except for that Medicare program by Johnson, we will now, thanks to the aging of my generation, be forced to deal with it on a continuous basis. So we will have a series of healthcare reforms in small steps, and we will get to a single-payer system eventually, because at some point we will realize that this is the only system that works. It just we have to still get out of this anti-communist Reaganite mindset that everything government does is shit, And it's not. I know the healthcare system of France very well, of Canada very well. My in-laws live up there. I have a house there. I'm Austrian, so I know also the healthcare system of Austria because most of my family still lives there. And I can tell you there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, it's all, healthcare is just who transfers the money between the patient and the doctor. And you can leave a private insurance agency, or you can have the government do it fairly automatically. Okay, the kind of discourse given about other systems. When you travel around, the others are saying, they're listening to this, of course, because everybody watching CNN and whatever. They're like, what are they talking about, right? It's like, and that gets me to the other point, right? You do have a system where industry is organized in terms of buying votes. And that has to do with how we organize our democracy. But a lot of that has to do with the vacuum also existing by how the public and politicians interact. And that vacuum gets filled, right? You don't have a strong party system. You don't have public election financing. You have a whole bunch of things that make this kind of set of biases that drive our politics what they are, right? But they can be changed. You can break that. And part of what's interesting and important is how the legal protection that corporations do get as persons, right? And that's a legal dogma that I think will be changed by subsequent Supreme Court justices that are going to gradually replace the Supreme Court. That's a slow process, of course. But I saw that the first question that Sotomayor asked in the Clinton movie case was precisely about that. Maybe this decision to give corporations personal status is the wrong decision. And no Supreme Court justice has ever voiced this since the 1880s. So that's an interesting question, right, that was raised there, and I took note of that. All of these are tied to our political power structure. And when I say finance is in power precisely because it is the most direct influence on government, right? You have, of course, you have pharmaceutical companies, you have a whole set of lobbies, but nobody anywhere near is as powerful as finance because it can blackmail you. It can say, look, if you don't bail me out, I'll kill everybody around me. And so it's a hostage situation, right?
With the collapse of the subprime mortgage industry in this country, is it safe to say that really this whole problem kind of falls back to a lack of financial education in this country? I mean, you had people that couldn't afford the closing costs on their home, so they'd get a seller's concession, 100% financing because they had no down payment to put on their house, and they didn't know any better, so they literally would buy a $500,000-$600,000 house that they had no business even looking at, and that ultimately was the catalyst to the situation that we're in now. Is it safe to say that, I mean, one of the best ways to not relive this situation again is to maybe also reform our education system? I mean,
yes.
I remember diddling with Bunsen burners in 6th grade, but yet I'm not a bio major. I would have loved maybe to learn how to do a loan calculation.
Financial education is very important, and I think actually this is a good business, by the way. Look at Susie Orman. But it can be done better than she does. And we in our department are actually thinking about how we can help and how we can have courses and distance learning courses in financial education. So we recognize this, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's also an underlying culture, right, of material culture of having and having it now, and there's a conspiracy of goodwill and optimism. Okay. It's very. I've seen it myself, right? I mean, I'm a pretty smart person, and I'm not immoral as a person. But when banks call you and say, "Look, here's money, take it," it's pretty hard to say no, right? And so you have to rethink this whole question of consumer finance. That's why I think that this idea of a consumer finance protection agency that is part of the reform plan of Guttmann and Obama is actually a good idea, because that's part of getting us into a more reasonable sense of intertemporal living, of planning what we do now and what we do later and so forth, which is part of what we do. I mean, we are too much of an instant gratification culture. We don't look back very much, and we don't look forward very much. And that's a really, really big problem, especially in terms of transferring wealth and knowledge to the next generation, right? When you are an instant gratification culture, it's harder for my generation to actually assure the health and wealth of the next generation, right? And one of the reasons I'm a teacher is precisely because I feel this responsibility of social usefulness in terms of helping with the next generation.
Yeah. Hi, thanks for another great presentation. Quick question is this. You're very laudatory about Bernanke's contribution after the crash. It seems to me that Bernanke and Greenspan were co-conspirators in causing this. See, it's like they committed malpractice and afterwards kept the patient from dying.
Correct.
So why didn't you mention that?
Well, because I'm a structuralist. I don't know whether that means anything to you, but I don't blame individuals. I blame conditions that guide individual thinking. Okay, and one of the great aspects of this long wave that I was talking about at the very beginning is that you have you have successive rounds of risk taking that work, so that in the next risk that works gives you high returns, and you have like the great moderation, you have stability, but underneath the stability you have like this incredible earthquake kind of faults gradually working their way together and then they explode. But you have a generalized climate of optimism justified by previous actions taken that worked out, and it would be very hard. I mean, Greenspan is Ayn Rand. He's a totally, I mean, he has his own philosophical. Greenspan is to be faulted just by where he's coming from, okay? But because he really believes he's the most kind of libertarian person philosophically that you can imagine. But there's a climate. There's a climate, and Bernanke before the crisis, and Greenspan are part of that climate. So that you have 3-4 rounds of cycles where everything works out. You land softly. You go back up. You have 3 consecutive bubbles, and it's fine. You can clean them up. You think that you're God when you go through this, and that's totally human, right? So we have to go back to how we are as social animals. And so I don't want to blame persons, because I would have probably made the same mistake as Greenspan or Bernanke.
Well, that's why Hyman Minsky is so popular
That's
now, right?
exactly the guy I'm talking about. So if you really want to understand somebody who understands finance and has an understanding of financial crisis, especially the super cycle crisis, that's Hyman Minsky.
Okay,
that's one of my great economists that I love.
Thank you.
Unemployment is a very severe drain on an economy.
Yes.
Things that could be made aren't made. People languish when they want to be making them. Roosevelt had a different approach to a stimulus. He instituted WPA and other projects where he
CCC,
directly
yes.
employed people.
Yes.
Why is that not the right thing to be doing now, or is it?
On some levels we do it. It's not as organized as it was because it's not federally organized. It's organized as part of the stimulus package. It gets organized through the states. But I think that if we had to do the stimulus package now, we would probably do it differently, and we would do it with a socially useful public employment component included.
Infrastructure.
Infrastructure, correct. And not just infrastructure, but smart infrastructure, retrofitting infrastructure, a variety of projects for which we could actually use probably 2, 3, 4 million jobs right away. And you in this climate, with this political landscape, you have only one shot. He may have another shot a bit later, right? And he had to do it extremely fast. Right? So he being Obama. So I think that the other difference is that while you have high unemployment, it's still not 25% of the labor force 2 years, 3 years into the crisis, as was the case with Roosevelt. I mean, Roosevelt faced 25% unemployment already in the third, and it was the third year of that phenomenon when he came to power and had the chance to launch all these programs. He did, by the way, then create 14 million jobs in the public sector.
Thank you.
Now, you've spoken on the need of a new international currency system.
Yes.
How exactly would that work, or what it would entail?
Well, it can either be allowed to take care of itself in an evolutionary sense, where we're moving away from the dollar into a multi-currency system. arguably the European currency, the euro, and then the yuan. The Chinese are very rapidly, the Chinese decided at the very beginning of the crisis to basically fairly radically shift into deregulating and internationalizing the yuan. And so they've made a lot of strides surprisingly fast after having spent years not to have to do this and trying to prevent it, right? So fairly soon you're going to have anyway, even if we don't do anything, a tripolar system within the next 10, 15 years. And then the question, if you just leave it at that, the question is how do you manage a tripolar system, right? And you will see first steps being taken tomorrow, because tomorrow you're going to have this accord of international coordination. Very, very important step in the right direction, okay? But the international coordination has no teeth, so it depends on the goodwill of countries and the moral suasion of other countries saying, you don't do what you're supposed to do it. That has never worked, right? So this is not the end of the story. And then the end of the story is to beef up something that for Americans is not yet at all known, but is lurking out there, the special drawing rights by the IMF, okay, which is a basket of currencies. And the IMF will be reformed. That's another decision to be taken tomorrow. And as a result of that, it'll be in a better situation to become a global central bank. And it will then, we will move to this SDR system. Now, the question then is, what kind of SDR system? How do we move there? Right? Those are the last two chapters of the book that I'm writing right now. But there are a bunch of people. I'm like, I think the only American that I know right now, other than couple of my friends that are thinking. But there's a lot of buzz about this elsewhere in the world. And the SDRs have been frozen since 1972, but they were liberated last April when, in the last G20 meeting, the governments agreed to issue $250 billion worth of new SDRs. And so that's a first tiny little step in the direction towards making them the new global currency. And for that, I mean, you have this idea, Keynes, the great economist of the 20th century, his last idea before he died was this SDR-based system. I mean, he had Bancor, he called it Bancor. So you can also go back to that economist and see where we were at. This was then considered a utopian idea, shot down by the U.S. in the Bretton Woods conference in July '44. But it's still an idea that he spent a lot of time thinking through, and it's a beautiful plan. Okay? And it's a plan for a blueprint for a global governance management of a globalized economy.
Thank you. How would the failure of the next round of Doha trade talks affect globalization and even the efficient market hypothesis?
Well, there's two things. I mean, globalization goes on in a helter-skelter fashion, and what you have right now without the Doha round is a dominance of centrifugal tendencies in the world economy, right? Meaning that if you have the euro emerging as a competitor to the dollar, and then the yuan emerging as a competitor to the dollar, you get a monetary fragmentation. While you also have this financial centralization where fewer and fewer large financial institutions run the global credit system, right? And you're going to get these tensions. And those tensions have to be managed by global governance. And a key aspect of that global governance is the Doha round. And without that, you're going to have a harder time keeping the world economy integrated and balanced. So you need to have that, right? If not, you have a much more vulnerable world economy. That's one thing, okay? The other thing is, your second aspect is the efficient market hypothesis, right? The efficient market hypothesis is a theory of financial market behavior. It's not based on, it's not related to trade. The only aspect that is related to trade there is the financial sector as a trade sector, but they already have their Doha since 1997. The financial sector has a global trade deal. The rest of the world, other sectors don't have that, right? But the efficient market hypothesis has been destroyed by this crisis. I'm still teaching it to graduate students in Paris, but I'm now, like everybody, like this is like a nice little relic in the history of economic thought, right? nobody, I mean, even the most ardent supporters of that hypothesis, and that hypothesis was 92% of the economists, financial economists here, have to admit that something ran afoul there. So you have also this vacuum in financial economics, which is fascinating, right? Which is why Minsky is coming back, by the way, and other non-mainstream financial economists are coming back. But yeah, that's my answer.
Okay, I have a question on a financial investing perspective. On a personal note, for people that had pulled out of the market right after they took it on the chin, and let's just talk about people that are conservative-minded in their investment perspective. Seeing that things have started to go out, but yet not knowing what shape this curve is going to be on the way up and how long it's going to take, would you be able to offer any personal perspectives or advice, realizing that you don't have a crystal ball, but that's one of the reasons I came out. I was just curious to get your feedback on what you thought might be appropriate at this point in time with what you might know.
Well, there's two answers to this. One is that I never ever, as a matter of principle, do make any advice to anybody else other than my own family, okay? And even my family whips my ass all the time about that. You just can't do that. You can't do that. And I can't say anything about it. Even if I say a little bit about it, you can construe it in a way that I didn't want you to construe it, and that's it. This is not my job. But I can tell you in the most global sense that there are always great opportunities out there, and that if you know a little bit about it, you are better to make your decisions than leaving it up to money market and stock fund managers who generally perform below average as a group. So I think that in terms of really being serious about financial investing, you need to know a lot about what you want to do and how you're going to do it, and then do it, and do it slowly, and do it methodically, and stick to it. And you know, that's my own philosophy. That doesn't mean that I've not lost a lot, okay?